Okay, so now let's talk about the decision-making process that happens in the courts when the courts get a case. So imagine that there's a case that has to do with freedom of speech. We'll just say freedom of speech. And there's a case where somebody was arrested, and after they were arrested, they broke some law, something that they supposedly weren't allowed to say. Like there's a law that said if you advocate the overthrow of the government, it's illegal and you can be arrested. So somebody walks around and they go ahead and they advocate for the overthrow of the government, not violent, the overthrow of the government, and they get arrested and they say, hey, the First Amendment protects my right to go ahead and say that. I can say whatever I want. I have First Amendment rights. And so they go ahead and they sue the government. They say, you can't go ahead and arrest me. That's unconstitutional. If you're a judge, right, in that case, so you're sitting there, guy comes up, you say, what's this case? And he tells you, this is what I was arrested for, and the First Amendment protects my right to free speech. As a judge, here's what you're not going to do. You can't just go like, you know, dude, you're kind of a creep, you know, guilty as charged. Or, you know, I think you're kind of guilty. You can't just base it on your own feelings or your own opinions. What judges have to do is they go through a two-step process. The first thing that they do is they locate the precedent. The precedent. What do I mean by precedent? The precedent would be previous cases that were similar to the one that you were dealing with right now. So in the case of some sort of case that had to do with free speech, the first thing that I would do is I would go ahead and I would look to past cases that dealt with freedom of speech. Each one of those decisions is a precedent. Precedent comes from precedes. It came before. Right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to look for previous rulings in similar cases and find as many as I can that are similar to what I have. Right? So if there's a case before me where somebody was denied access to the voting booth, right? Because let's say they didn't have the proper ID or something like that, and they say that was unconstitutional. What am I going to do? I'm going to go locate the precedent. I'm going to look for previous cases that dealt with voter ID, people being denied access. I'm going to look for the previous rulings in similar cases. And I'm going to read up on what judges have said in the past. Okay? That's the first part. So the first part is, again, what judges don't just decide on their own, like, oh, this is how I feel about it, and make a decision. They go and they look for the precedent. They look for previous rulings in similar cases that are similar to the ones that they're dealing with. Then there's something called the doctrine of stare decisis. The doctrine of stare decisis. And what that basically means is that they're supposed to support the rulings in the earlier decisions. They're supposed to, I think stare decisis means let the decision stand. That if you look back and you find the precedents, right, cases that have been decided before, and let's say in each of these cases they ruled in favor of the government, or in each of those cases they ruled in favor of the defendant, then what you do is you support those earlier cases. You follow the precedent. You say, okay, you had a free speech claim. You argued that your freedom of speech was denied. I looked back at these 6 or 7 cases. The judges all made a similar ruling based on this argument. I'm going to use the same argument. You're guilty. You're going to follow the precedent, right? So it's a two-stage process. You get a case as a judge. What you're going to do is you're going to go ahead and look for past cases that are similar, see what other judges have ruled, right? And then you're going to go ahead and, especially if it's consistent for most of the time. Oh, the sun's coming out. If it's consistent for most of the time, most of the decisions, then you're going to uphold that rule. That's the decision. That's the doctrine of stare decisis. Now, that's the general rule, but you can go ahead and overturn the decisions. You can go ahead and say, you know what, I think they got it wrong. So I want to give you sort of an extended example of how this plays out. Talking about a couple cases that you may be familiar with. You probably should be, so if you're not, you will be by the time we're done. In 1895, there was a very famous case called Plessy versus Ferguson. This case was one where there was this man. He was apparently 1/8 black, 7/8 white. I saw a picture of me. Basically looks white. But back then, if you had the rule was, I think the 1% rule, the 1 drop rule. If you had 1 drop of black blood, you were considered black. So he was considered black. Now, again, just looking at him, you wouldn't know it. But what happened was all set up specifically to go to court. There was a law that said that blacks had to ride in the back of the train. It was like 2 different trains, a front car and a back car. Mr. Plessy went ahead and he went and sat in the front car, and he was told that he needed to go to the back car, and he refused, and he was arrested. And when he was arrested, he said this rule that separates us is unconstitutional. It violates the 14th Amendment. That it says that there needs to be equal protection for everybody. So he brought his case to court, and the judges ruled, this is where they came up with their very famous ruling, separate but equal. Right? That you could have separate facilities as long as they were equal, and as long as they were equal, it did not violate the 14th Amendment. So you could have separate railroad cars, separate bus depots, separate hospitals, separate schools, separate drinking fountains, as long as everything was equal. Now, before we continue, hopefully you know this. If not, brace yourself. The railroad cars, the hospitals, the drinking fountains weren't equal at all. But what the court's rulings made it possible for them to go ahead and sort of allow that to go by and not be much of a problem. So in any case, the courts ruled separate but equal. As long as they're separate but equal, it doesn't violate the 14th Amendment. That case, Plessy versus Ferguson, after that ruling, became the precedent. That became the precedent. So if somebody got a case after 1895 that had to do with the races being separate, they would go back and they would say, I need to go find the precedent, right? What are the precedent? They would go back to Plessy versus Ferguson, and they would say, okay, there's a case that's similar to the one that I'm dealing with, and following the doctrine of stare decisis, I'm going to uphold that same decision, and I'm going to say separate but equal, that you can have separate institutions, even though, but they're equal, and that doesn't violate the 14th Amendment. So Plessy becomes the precedent. Then, if I go ahead and make a decision, let's say in 1899, I make a decision, and I support the Plessy decision, then I become a precedent for future cases. Right? Then if somebody else in 1912 has a case that has to do with separation of the races, they're going to look back to my decision, they're going to look back to the Plessy decision, and they're going to go ahead and say, well, those are the precedent, and based on the doctrine of stare decisis, I'm going to uphold the previous decisions. That's how precedent works. But you can go ahead and overturn the precedent. You can reverse the decision. So in 1954, in Brown versus the Board of Education, there was a challenge to these laws that said that blacks and whites had to go to different schools. There were actually 5 cases that were folded into Brown versus the Board of Education, but that's again that's not relevant to what I'm trying to get across. In that particular case, the courts looked back at the precedent. They looked at Plessy, they looked at the decisions made afterwards, and they basically said, you guys got it wrong. What they ruled was that separate but equal, that whole idea, did in fact violate the 14th Amendment. Their argument was, in 1954, that if you had separate institutions, they were inherently unequal. That there was no way to have them be equal. If you separated them, they were going to be unequal, and as such, they violated the 14th Amendment. Now, as soon as they went ahead and they made that ruling, they overturned the precedent, and now Brown versus Board of Education became the new precedent. Then, past Brown versus Board of Education, past 1954, if somebody got a case about the races being treated differently, when a judge looked back, he would look back to the Brown decision, and that would become the precedent. How have the courts ruled in the past? He may look at Plessy, he may look at other cases, but he'll note that Brown versus Board of Education changed it, and as a result, that'll be the place they'll look to go ahead and see what past decisions have been made. So that becomes the new precedent that other judges follow. right? But again, you can't overturn it. So that's how it works. The judicial process, it's a very sort of rigorous process. Judges don't just go ahead and look at the facts in the case and decide what they want to do just based on their own feelings, right? You don't just look at it and go, you know, I think it's wrong to go ahead and have segregation, therefore I'm going to find that law unconstitutional. It doesn't work that way. First, they look for the precedent, cases that have been decided, similar cases that have been decided previously, and they generally adhere to the doctrine of stare decisis, that they're going to let the previous decision stand. Okay? And that ends this video. I will see you momentarily.